Assalamu alaikum, welcome to the Progeny Podcast. Today my guest is Madiha Raza. Madiha is the Senior Global Communications Officer at the International Rescue Committee, where her portfolio consists of 23 countries including some Africa as well as Yemen. She has worked with a variety of international NGOs including United Nations Association, Islamic Relief, Swedish Development Advisors and Muslim Aid. In addition, Madiha has valuable on-the-ground experience and has visited many countries affected by war, disease or natural disaster. In the last few years, she has worked in Greece during the refugee crisis. She visited Mosul in Iraq 2 days after liberation and Syria multiple times, as well as the Jordanian and Lebanese refugee camps. Madiha, thank you for joining the Progeny. It's good to have you. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Thank you for having me.
There's a lot to talk about, inshallah, in today's podcast. First, a bit about your background, where you grew up.
So I grew up here in the UK, in a small town called Northwood in northwest London. I have 4 elder sisters, 2 parents, alhamdulillah. And spent my whole life here in the UK until I moved to Sweden in 2015 for 2 years. I came back from Sweden in 2017 and been here since then, and I'm moving to Nairobi in 2 weeks.
MashaAllah. Your line of work is quite interesting, the path you chose after your degree. Of course, we know as Muslims, we are told that one of the best deeds to do is to offer charity. Why did you choose this path?
I think that's exactly it. I mean, when I was doing my A-levels, and I saw the sort of level of poverty and destruction around the world, there's sort of one of 2 paths I could have chosen, I guess. My family are all bankers. I could have gone down that path and, earned lots of money and given it to charity, or I could have chosen the other route of being more hands-on and working on grassroots level to try and tackle the issues I was seeing on the news or around the world or when I was traveling with my family. And that's the route I chose to go down. I think I took that inspiration from my mum, who always told me examples of how when she grew up in what is now Bangladesh, used to be East Pakistan at the time, she would always invite people who were off the streets over to dinner, and she would just tell her mum that, "Mum, I've invited 5 people who are homeless to come and eat with us today." So stories like that were always really inspiring, and I felt like going into that line of work would have been able to help me be more hands-on and be more sort of responsive on a frontline basis. And I'm very, very blessed to be able to have a career which is so purposeful, because then it doesn't feel like a career, it doesn't feel like a job. And so, as you said, we're very much encouraged by religion, by the Ahl Bayt, to be charitable and help the less fortunate. And I guess I feel like it's a sense of duty almost. So, yeah, very, very blessed, and that's the reason why I chose to go down that path.
In the introduction I mentioned you visited 23 countries just for aid and help and support.
My portfolio consists of 23 countries in Africa.
23 countries. So yeah. For someone maybe who's a Muslim and from a Muslim background, how did your family support you, or were they supportive? Were they, might be difficult maybe for someone to say, I'm going to let my daughter travel for sometimes long periods, I'm guessing.
A couple of weeks at a time, yeah.
How did they take that?
So I get asked that question a lot, actually. I think my parents, alhamdulillah, are very, very, very supportive. I think they understand that this is my passion. They understand that I don't, I always go with I've got security training, for example. I don't go although I do go into sort of war zones and risky countries. Me being a woman or female has not made a difference to them, because I've explained to them, and I explained to many people, that me being a woman and being able to be on the ground is super advantageous, because it's always women that are more affected by war and disaster. It's always women that are exploited or abused when they have to flee from conflict or disasters. And so being a woman aid worker is different to being a man, because the sort of comfort that I'm able to provide, or the conversations I'm able to have with these women that are affected. Like, for example, you mentioned that I'd been to Mosul 2 days after liberation, and I'd met all of these Yazidi women, for example, or I'd met all these hundreds of displaced women from different parts of Iraq in southern Mosul, in Hammam al-Alil camp in southern Mosul, and they're very conservative societies. So the way in which I was able to interact with those women who had been through such atrocities was amazing. And I think my parents understand that if something was to happen to me, then it would have been almost in the way of Allah, in the way of charity, in the way of doing something good. So they're very supportive, and I'm very blessed in that way.
One of the many countries that's not only affected by war but also disease is Yemen. The hadith from the Holy Prophet ﷺ says that the Muslim Ummah should be like one body. If one part of the body is in pain, then the whole body feels that pain. Yemen is one of those countries where the International Rescue Committee do aid and work. How bad is the situation in Yemen from the work that you do and from what you've heard?
It is pretty bad. Yemen has just entered its 7th year of, I'm not going to say the 7th year of war, it's the 7th year since the escalation of the war. And, I can run some stats, but, we have to always remember that behind every statistic there are people. For example, Yemen's just recorded its highest level ever of malnutrition for children under 5. 20 million people in the country are going hungry every day. Famine is looming, basically. And the thing is, when famine is declared in a country, by the point it gets to that point, it's too late already for millions of people that could die or be affected. And of course, although COVID-19 is in Yemen and there's a spike right now of cases, it's not a priority for ordinary Yemeni. The priority for them is where are they going to get their next meal from? How are they going to feed their children? So when we do surveys for people in Yemen, before we do our programming there to see how we can assist them, they always say to us, it's not a priority, it's not a concern for us. How are we going to eat? That's our priority. We did a survey of over 30,000 people over the last year, where it was really concerning to see the sort of the negative coping strategies people are using as a result of not being able to obtain food. So either cutting down the number of meals they're having, or adults are having to eat less to feed their children, or borrow food from people. And coronavirus, although might not have affected the country itself directly, it's more sort of like because of global supply chains being restricted.
To make things more difficult.
Prices are rising in Yemen, so fuel costs are rising, and all of these things have a knock-on effect on how much money you've got to spend at the end of the day to buy food for your family in a country which is completely war-torn. And then that has secondary effects like health implications in a country where 50% of the hospitals aren't working. So it is really bad, and I'd really urge people to sort of not forget what's going on there, even though it might not always pop up in the news every day.
Before moving on to my next point, you mentioned you urge people to not forget about Yemen and to think about, other than thinking about them, what can people really do for Yemen? I mean, I feel like you mentioned everything's become more difficult with COVID-19. Delivering humanitarian aid has become more difficult for a lot of organizations. Inshallah, we'll talk about that, and how these organizations are providing aid in such difficult times. But normal people maybe listening to this podcast, they know about Yemen. They know the fact that you say it's 7 years since the war, since the escalation of war. Yemen hasn't been mentioned in the news recently, maybe because there's other things happening that are even less important, but they've just sort of sidelined Yemen and their problems. It's been going on for a long time, but what can people do here, sitting maybe back home?
Firstly, I think, donate to the organisations that are working there. There are so many within our own community, Lady Fatima Trust, WF Aid, obviously the organisation I work for, International Rescue Committee, and I'm in touch with the teams on the ground every day about what's going on there. But apart from donating, I think everyone that might be watching has the power to do something more, depending on where you are and how your country is involved with the coalition or the war. Lobby your government, send letters asking them to stop selling arms to Saudi Arabia, for example, or, lobby the government to use their position on the global platform to make change. And the thing is that the advantage of living in a democracy and having a voice is that you can do things like that. And that's really, really important to keep that pressure on. The UK, for example, has just reduced its overseas aid budget from 0.7% to 0.5% of sort of gross national income. And in a situation where globally the world is vulnerable and those countries that really need aid are needing it now more than ever, it is not the time to cut overseas aid budget. So what I'm saying is, we need to use our voice, which we have in countries like this, but we're very blessed to be able to raise our voice. We need to continue doing that.
How difficult has it been for humanitarian aid organizations, NGOs, to deliver aid during COVID, knowing that now aid's more needed for certain countries? And like you said, some countries are worrying about themselves. I think since the start of COVID, something that I have learned is the selfishness of certain people during such difficult times. We had people fighting over
toilet paper.
Right? So, and yet we've now shown that we're selfish beings, caring about ourselves. I'm talking in general, obviously not specific people, but governments only caring about themselves. You see the problems between, for example, the UK and the EU. I'm hearing all these stories about some vaccines not being delivered.
Vaccine nationalism, yeah.
So all this stuff happening, it must be really difficult for organizations to actually get the aid where it's needed the most.
Well, the large organizations, so the International Rescue Committee, for example, they already have country teams. So we're already in the country. We already have massive teams in each country in which we operate. So in terms of that, there are not so much capacity issues, but there definitely are funding issues. So just as I mentioned earlier, there's been massive funding cuts because countries are obviously diverting their funds to sort of their COVID response. But if you look at it this way, in the UK or US or wherever we might be in the West, if the issues are so bad in countries like that, then you can imagine how bad it is in countries which have no health infrastructure, for example, and how more than ever that funding is needed. And the thing is, in a situation where none of us are safe from COVID until all of us are safe from COVID. So
Correct.
until everyone in the world is vaccinated, none of us are safe. So there's no point of having a vaccine nationalism. There's no point just protecting your own country, because in the end, all of us are not safe. So it is very difficult. And, we're pushing for, because you might know that, for example, most of the Western countries have ordered sort of excess vaccines. So we're pushing for those to be donated to countries that need it, that aren't able to afford it. So, for example, in Yemen, they're saying that they're not going to get the vaccine until another 2 years.
Wow.
And that's the case for many developing countries, because of affordability, because of, a lack of sort of volume and how, there's no supply. So, there's no end in sight for some of these countries when it comes to COVID, at least.
And with regards to you traveling, I know you've just returned from Ethiopia. How has that been during COVID?
Oh, the number of tests I've had I've had about 9 tests in the last year. It's been difficult. Surprisingly, I wasn't asked why I was going when I flew out at the beginning of February. It's fine as long as you've sort of got all your papers in check and you've had all your tests and everything. But I mean, it is because it's for work. It's been fine, but it's been cumbersome for sure.
How bad is the crisis in Ethiopia, and what are the main concerns there for people?
So in northern Ethiopia, there's an area called Tigray, where the Tigrayans are fighting against the Ethiopian Defense Force and the Eritrean forces and Amharan forces. It's pretty bad. When I was there was sort of no electricity, no Wi-Fi, no reception. So the operating environment as a humanitarian organization was very, very difficult. And 1.2 million people just in that region of Ethiopia had been displaced internally. They were being driven out from their little towns. And sometimes they were sort of hiding in forests for fear of being sort of persecuted. Some people told me that they were living on leaves for a month. Women were being attacked and exploited on the journey. And so when they were arriving in these displacement camps, they were severely malnourished, they were severely traumatized. And it was really bad. And I think the worst issue was, at the point that I was there, was that there was a massive lack of humanitarian access. We were being blocked from going in to deliver aid. And that's often the situation in countries like this, where there's conflict happening, where humanitarian access is really, really difficult and we're not able to reach those in need. That's eased up a little bit now, but there's still a massive need in the country.
Describe us something that you saw, or scenario where you saw, where you thought, in Ethiopia,
Okay.
that you thought, for us living back home, we have a blessing that we don't even really thank Allah for.
Oh, so many. So I went to a displaced people's camp where there were just thousands of people. So this was an abandoned school where people were coming to stay. There were thousands of people. Over half of them are children. And there was a classroom, if you imagine the classroom, maybe double the size of this room, where 50 people have to sleep all at once, on the concrete floor. But there were so many children, and you saw the children didn't have shoes. They were super, super skinny, matted hair because they wouldn't have been able to shower for ages. And, they were just playing with stones outside. How you might see, for example, in the streets in Iraq sometimes when you've got orphans. And I interviewed a lot of the displaced people. One of the men who I spoke to told me about how he was detained, how he was beaten up while he was detained. He showed me his, he had marks on his back because he'd been beaten up. Another man had been shot, and so, he showed us his bullet wound. So the persecution that these people were going through was really, really horrific. And then the same with the women. I don't want to sort of trigger anyone, so there's sort of a trigger warning here, I guess. But, women had been widely sexually abused on the way from wherever they've been displaced. And this is very, very normal of humanitarian crises. So whether you've been displaced because of flooding or a tsunami or an earthquake, or because of conflict, women are always the ones.
Victims.
Yeah, the victims, always the worst adversely affected. And so just the trauma you see in their eyes or when they're talking to you is something that I hope no one ever has to imagine.
How do you, seeing these, and obviously you've been doing this for quite some time. How do you mentally cope? How's your mental health, knowing that you...
I get asked this question a lot. For me, so they say that 40% of humanitarians need therapy, which I don't think I need yet, alhamdulillah. Do you know what I think it is? I think for me, when I'm sitting here in the UK and I see it on the news and I'm not able to do anything and I'm feeling helpless, that affects me more than when I'm actually out there being able to help, being able to speak to these people and seeing how resilient they are. And one of the things I did want to say was that regardless of all of this, regardless of everything they've been through, anywhere I've been in the world, whether it's the Syrian refugees in Lebanon or Jordan or within Syria, or those women I spoke to in Mosul or Indonesia, anywhere in the world, or, the Syrians in Greece, for example, even though their entire lives have been sort of turned upside down within sometimes a matter of minutes, they're still at peace, they're still happy, they're resilient, they're thankful. In Indonesia, for example, a lot of them are Muslim. And, you ask them, are you okay? How are you feeling? And they'll just be like, this is the will of Allah. They're really sort of faithful. They're really sort of, and I think that's the thing. Faith brings such resilience to them, and it's really a lesson. So I almost feel like, given what these people have been through, I don't really like to focus on what my mental health is like, though I understand why I need to. But I'm able to draw lessons and resilience from them, I think. And given that I'm able to actually help and be there on the ground, it helps me with that sort of emotional drain, rather than not being able to help and being helpless.
You mentioned a few times, you say when I was talking to them, when they were talking to me, you do a lot of talking with these people, and I feel sometimes, and this is just a lot of these people just want to talk sometimes. Is that something that you always do when you especially with women, I'm guessing, because you mentioned that sometimes with the women, they'll probably feel more comfortable speaking about what maybe they went through, or even not necessarily ask for help, as in financial help or food, but they'd rather just want to sort of talk.
So it's part of my role to kind of gather case studies to see what the need is, to see what people, and we're obviously very careful about how we phrase questions and that kind of thing, to make sure that we're not sort of bringing up past trauma. But it's part of my role to sort of understand what the need is and to see how our work is helping or impacting them. So before I speak to them, I always explain sort of why I'm speaking to them, and who I am and where I come from, and then I show them pictures of my family or my life back here in the UK. Because if I'm sort of delving into their life, or if I'm imposing and asking them to tell me about themselves, then I think it's only right that I sort of tell them a bit about myself. But yeah, more often than not, they do want the world to know what's going on. They do want people to know what they've been through. Especially if it's conflict. But yeah, I think, talking it out sometimes just helps. And I'm very, very blessed, because there are so many refugees around the world who will raise their hand and dua for me, for example, or for my parents. And, so many countless all around the world. I don't even know who or what their names are sometimes. I might not be able to remember, but in that way, I'm very, very blessed. And again, from them, you can really pull resilience from them, just because they're so strong even after everything they've been through.
With regards to the Muslims, you mentioned in Indonesia and others, then maybe even Christians or even people. How does what's God's role within their lives? How do they, you mentioned the ones in Indonesia who was because of an earthquake and tsunami.
Indonesia, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So how did they, how have they got this patience, this will to say, this is alhamdulillah, it's a blessing, but it's the will of Allah? Do you see that quite a lot?
I see that in all the Muslim refugees and the non-Muslim. I feel like the less people have, the more faithful they are, or the more at peace they are. And this is the thing often, except for maybe in Syria, where they were all quite like middle-class, wealthy people before the war started. Normally, in most of the crisis situations I've been to, the people that have been displaced or are refugees are already from quite poor villages or areas, but they're always very happy, sort of at peace people. And every time, in Indonesia, for example, they were very sort of resigned to the fact that this is Allah's will, and they are very accepting of it. And I feel like there's almost a piece of research to be done there about how faith can be used as a resilience tool in situations like this. Because everywhere, whether it's Syrian refugees or the Indonesians, everyone is almost thankful or very sort of, I don't know what the word is, but they sort of resign themselves to the fact that this is Allah's will, and they're accepting it, and they're happy, and they're at peace with it.
Tawakkul, maybe.
Tawakkul, absolutely.
They leave everything in Allah's hands, which is quite difficult sometimes.
But it puts things into perspective. Like when I'm sitting here with my, silly problems in the UK, it really makes me think back, and it makes me really it really grounds me. I think it really makes me look at things in a different way, because comparatively, and I know I don't want to say that we are sort of feeding off their misery or making myself feel better through their misery. Of course not. But it definitely puts things into perspective, given that they can be thankful having lost everything, including family members, their business, their lives, their homes, and they can still be thankful, and I have everything, alhamdulillah, and I'm not. So it really helps put things into perspective.
Someone might say, how did Madiha survive without internet in Ethiopia?
It was liberating, honestly.
Because I notice sometimes when WhatsApp or Instagram is down, everyone's like, oh no, WhatsApp's not working. What am I going to do with my life now?
Yeah.
And then you're there without internet. I'm guessing no one really thinks of that as a problem back there.
Yeah, well, it was surprising. It was liberating, but surprisingly crippling. Like, come 7 p.m, I was sat in the dark in the room. I was like, okay, what do I do now? Because, there was nothing to do. I couldn't use my laptop, couldn't use my phone because I was trying to conserve battery. But it was liberating. Honestly, those few days, I felt more at peace than... There's something about always having access, always being online. I think that it messes with your mind. And I think not having internet for those few days was actually quite liberating.
With regards to the refugee crisis, I mean, a few years ago when there was this surge of refugees trying to get into Europe through Turkey and other countries, and we saw those images and videos of the real crisis. I mean, the problem of refugees, the problem of migrants, has been something that's ever since I think humanity were created, and during the life of the Holy Prophet, he migrated, we can say, as a seeking refuge from Mecca, because he was the Quraysh wanted to kill him, so he wanted to seek refuge. Before him, he sent some of his companions as those first to do the migration from Mecca to Abyssinia, Ethiopia, modern day Ethiopia, the likes of Ja'far al-Tayyar, and then he obviously migrated to Medina. We saw a few years ago this, this all over the news, but recently I've noticed it's as if they don't exist anymore. It's as if all these refugees that were stuck in Greece. That's my where are it's as if they've all now got homes and they're okay. And
no. Well, we just
you visited Greece what year?
2016.
Okay.
At the height of the crisis.
5 years ago.
Yeah. Wow, it's been 5 years. Yeah.
And they're still there.
Many of them are, yes. So it was interesting when I was there. The situation every day was changing. I was on the island of Lesbos, which was on the news quite a lot. At the time, I was actually living in Sweden, which also had, I think they'd taken in 160,000 Syrian refugees, and all my friends were for example, my Swedish class were Syrian refugees. And again, like so many stories of resilience there. But we just commemorated 10 years of that war. What was it, 2 weeks ago, I think, now 10 years since the war started. And no, there are still so many in Lesbos. I don't know if you heard that there was a massive fire that destroyed one of the biggest camps a couple of weeks ago as well. And they were moved from one camp to another. But those people are still there. Many have been rehomed or been able to seek asylum, but many are still there. And this is the way the news cycle works. Sort of moves from one crisis to another, and then it gets forgotten until something massive happens, and it might spike in the news for a day or two, and then it gets forgotten again.
Yeah, I came as a refugee, obviously not in such circumstances where we had to come on a boat and go through a lot of difficulty. Obviously, fleeing from Iraq and the regime of Saddam. Alhamdulillah, I had the privilege of coming to the UK, studying here, and I got it easy compared to the refugees that in those days, maybe back in the 90s, it was easier to get asylum and get a refugee status. But now it's become more difficult because every country is putting a limit to how many refugees they take in. And like you said, a lot of them are still stuck there. What about, them returning? What's the possibility of some of these refugees actually returning home?
You mean willingly or being forced to?
Willingly. Forced to, obviously, no, because are there any that are willingly?
I think there would be, but you see, it depends because, as we always say, people don't leave their home unless there's something they're really running from. Because of the politics of the situation, if we're talking about Syria in particular, it might be that them going back is dangerous for them, or that they somehow feel that being in the West or being in Europe is going to be better for them economically, or they're able to make a better life. Which is almost difficult to believe, given how hostile some of the Europeans are towards them, or not wanting to take them in. But naturally for them, they feel like that's still better than what's back home. So there's nothing stopping them from going back home, but it's about them not wanting to, for whatever reason they fled from there in the first place.
And obviously now there's no opportunity for it. Are there any countries taking refugees now, or?
There are. Everyone. So, for example, in the US, the Trump administration had cut down the refugee intake every year from like hundreds of thousands to 15,000. The Biden administration pledged to bring it back up to 125,000. That still hasn't happened, even though he's been in office for a few months. So yeah, but what is 125,000 comparatively to the millions that need refuge? And that's like the US is a massive economy; it's a massive country. There are countries taking refugees, but just not nearly as many as is needed. So it remains to be seen what happens, I guess.
And the refugee camps at the Lebanese Jordanian borders, that's still there, I'm guessing.
Oh yeah. I mean,
that consists of mostly Syrians or
Palestinians and Syrians. So the ones in depends on where, but the ones in Jordan, for example, that I visited, they're not the typical refugee camps where they're tents. They're sort of buildings, like whole towns of actual brick or mortar, whatever you want to call it, buildings. But often in those countries, the refugees don't have any rights. So they're not able to work, they're not able to get education. So whole generations of children are growing up either Palestinian or Syrian without any sort of education or means of livelihood in these massive sprawling camps around the world.
Muslim refugees in a Muslim country, and yet they don't have any rights.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, I guess, even for the host country, because as it is for their own citizens, they don't have enough opportunities. But I mean, as far as I'm concerned, we're all global citizens. There's no sort of us and them. But I guess from a national point of view, those looking out for their own sort of agenda will want to look after their own first.
Do you think there's a problem because these are Muslim refugees, that they're not maybe what, or is that
in Europe?
Faith,
you mean?
yeah, is faith got nothing to do with them being refugees?
It's difficult to say. Maybe. Well, yeah. I mean, well, definitely. I mean, in some countries like in Sweden when I was there, or the far right movement here in the UK, definitely plays a part. It just it depends on the government in question, doesn't it? In terms of how anti-Muslim or how far right their rhetoric is. And I mean, got to be careful there what I say, but, there was an announcement a few days ago talking about immigration and asylum and how there's going to be stricter measures. And it just goes to show the more that I just feel like more and more and more policies to do with the sort of poor or less privileged, there's just none. All the policies are catered towards those that are wealthy and privileged and white upper class, and whether it's Brexit or whether it's austerity or whether it's asylum and immigration, we seem to be going backwards as a country, and that's something I just don't understand. And I'm not sure whether that's something to do with those refugees being particularly Muslim, or whether it's something else. But also, it's we're not letting in refugees that are even from Eastern Europe, for example, and they're not Muslim. So I'm not sure it's anything to do with that in particular, but I definitely think it plays a part, a small part.
Yeah, plays a part, but I've heard from some people that I used to work with that would say things like is that the refugees are running away from Muslim dictators. There's Muslim countries all around that aren't welcoming these refugees. Why is it now become a problem for the West when their own Muslim countries, neighboring countries, are in conflict with each other. 1, 2, they're not welcoming each other. They're running away from.
But why are we seeing refugees? Why are we identifying refugees as their faith? They're just people. They're refugees. What's it got to do with them being Muslim?
Has humanity died? Do you think now working for how many years in humanitarian?
Almost 10 years.
Almost 10 years. Do you feel every year things are getting worse, or is there an improvement when it comes to?
I see things like the Rohingya genocide, and I was in Bangladesh when the Rohingyas were coming over the border back in 2017 from Myanmar, or I see what's happening to the Uyghurs, or I saw what's happening to some Shia Pakistanis, for example. And every time we just commemorated the Bosnian genocide or the Rwandan genocide or the Holocaust, and every time we commemorate those, we say, we're never going to let this happen again. But we're letting it happen again. It's happening. It's happening right now under our noses. And I just feel like we're all regurgitating the same rhetoric, and we're not really improving anything. And in the 10 years, whether it's climate change or government or policies or what, no, I wouldn't say anything's improved.
It's got worse.
I'm not sure if it's got worse, but it's definitely not improved. Obviously, if you take America or the UK, the Trump administration definitely was going backwards. I feel like the government here are going backwards in sort of very nationalistic policies. But yeah, I don't getting worse or getting better, I don't know, but it's definitely not getting better. It's not getting better even if it's not getting worse.
Which comes, so humanity as a concept, where, as Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam says, that you're either a brother in faith of someone, or he's your equal in humanity.
Yeah.
That sort of has died down, because now we pick and choose who we want to support.
Agreed. But I guess you said that when the pandemic hit, you saw a level of selfishness, which I definitely agree with. But I also saw a level of selflessness in the way that people came out to try and help or assist.
I'm sure.
But yeah, as a global community, I would definitely agree that the brother in faith and equal in humanity has definitely died down. And I think, there are some groups that will only want to help themselves or their own communities. And this is the thing, like even within our communities, I'm really against the sort of nationalism that we see within our communities, that, Iraqis will only help Iraqis, and Pakistanis will only help Pakistanis, and Khojas will only help Khojas, and Iranians will only help Iranians, and the list goes on. And I just feel like, what the Quran doesn't say, if you save one Iraqi or Khoja or Pakistani life, you save humanity. It says if you save one life, you save humanity. It doesn't put a sort of restriction to it. And I think that we need to sort of get out of that bubble, because, I feel like even if you just look at the event of Karbala, for example, the different sort of nationalities and faiths and everyone that was involved, I feel like it's a lesson for all of us. And I think we need to apply that across the board, whether it's our charity or who we welcome into our mosque. Gone a bit off tangent there. But
it's good you mentioned this, because I've actually wrote that down now before you mentioned it, which is we've become very selective who we support, and as you said, I'll only support my own people, and what I'll say in the back of my mind is because they're my people, so I'll help them. They need the help, and then I'll help others. But that I'll help others never ends up happening, because it goes back to our divide when it comes to our centers, where we have centers that are only allocated for a certain ethnic group within the same faith. And I feel that problem sort of will always exist.
Does it? I don't know. Does it only? I mean, I feel like I've only seen that in the UK.
Oh, okay. Is it?
I think so. Like some parts of America. So my sister lives in Texas, for example, in the city there. There's like 5 centers in Houston, and they all have mixed centers. I think in Nairobi, where I'm about to move to, I'm pretty sure Pakistanis and Iranians also attend that center.
I've seen that in some parts of the US, where it's a community with different
it's a shame that that's the case in the UK, because I feel like the UK sort of the sort of level of social justice that we're seeing amongst the youth in the UK, is really something to sort of aspire towards. And I think those youth could move forward and try and make it a bit more, mixed in terms of the different ethnicities, mixing together. I think there's so much value to be added with that.
With regards to, how you pick which international aid group you work with, I noticed, you were with the Islamic Relief, Muslim Aid, both Muslim NGOs, but at the same time you were also with
WF Aid, which was a Shia
group.
Yeah.
And then but you don't certainly pick, say, I'm only going to work with these people because they're Muslim.
No, not at all. I mean, I've worked for Malaria Consortium and now International Rescue Committee, which isn't Muslim at all. I guess in some ways I sort of just fell into it in the journey that I took. But yeah, for me, it doesn't, because every international organization has to work on the principles of neutrality and impartiality, where they don't pick and choose who they help, even if they work on principles of faith. So, for example, even Christian Aid works on principles of faith, of mercy and compassion and helping people, but they're not allowed to discriminate in terms of who they pick to help. So for me, it's more about sort of the organization where I feel like the most impact can be had. And, I just started this role at the International Rescue Committee about 6 months ago, and I feel very, very blessed to have this position, because it's one of the biggest NGOs in the world, and it has a massive footprint. And I'm really sort of blessed to be able to see the level of work that they do. So, for example, they've got such influence where they're able to influence, US government policy to, reverse certain policies, or we're able to put that pressure because of the impact that we have. And that's the way I would choose who I work with. And it's definitely nothing to do with faith.
Some people recently have put doubt into helping maybe certain charities, and without going into too much details, but there was a case where the one charity was found to have some corruption, and sort of all over social media with certain communities. My question: does it exist, corruption within charities?
Yeah. So I am a trustee of the Muslim Charities Forum, and one of the things we do is try and help the Muslim charity sector with governance, or like ensuring that they're compliant, because obviously the UK has a charity commission which takes care of and overlooks all of this and makes sure that there's no financial irregularities, etc. It definitely does happen, and I think although there's fantastic work being done by the Muslim charity sector, both in the wider Muslim charity sector as a whole, whether it's Sunni or Shia or whatever else, there's great work being done, but I think that we're still behind the curve in comparison to the rest of the charities in how we operate, in the professionalism with which we operate, in making sure that we are following governance protocols and the right operational kind of frameworks to be compliant. We need to make sure we've got safeguarding policies and money laundering policies, and the way in which we work needs to definitely be more professionalized. I've worked in now, 4 Muslim charities, 2 of the biggest Sunni charities, and one of the biggest, I guess, Shia charities, and all of them are striving to be better, and that's definitely the way to go. And I think we all need to keep on trying to improve. And the thing is, being a trustee is a massive responsibility, because you're basically running the whole charity, or you're responsible for running the charity, and you're responsible for people's amana, because they give you the money and they trust you to spend it the right way. So
why are Muslim charities, you mentioned that we're far behind other charities? What's the reason? Is it because why aren't they as professional as, maybe, I don't know if that's the right term to use, but
yeah, I mean, I'm probably going to get I wouldn't say they're not as professional. I think often we rely on our intentions a lot. Our intentions are good, so it's okay. But no, we're also in a government or under a framework where we have to comply. And I think often we sort of treat organizations like a charity or like a family, I mean, or we just rely on goodwill. But you can't rely on goodwill when you've got sort of audits and financial trails to submit to the Charity Commission. I don't really have a reason for why. I think you know, there's too much reliance on goodwill, and the intentions are great to want to help people, but it has to be backed up by, you know, the right level of professionalism in terms of compliance as well.
Well, but on the ground, you know, these people are vulnerable. A lot of these people that, you know, aid groups go out and support. From your experience, are there any issues with the aid that they receive? Is there any misuse of any of the aid that they're getting on the ground? Are some maybe women being mistreated, maybe?
I've not seen that personally, no.
Or heard of it. That doesn't mean you have.
You know, I think, you know, if I give some examples of what I meant when I said that we're still behind the curve.
Yeah.
So, you know, one of the examples is the wider charity sector, the non-Muslim charity sector, is moving now towards empowering those people that need help. So getting them back on their own feet. I feel like the Muslim charity sector, we're still stuck on handing out food baskets. You know, there's that saying where if you teach a man it's better to teach a man to fish than give him a fish. We're still giving people fish, you know, or we're still doing those sort of very tokenistic aid work, you know, building a well instead of building a water system in a village that will help the whole village with their washing and their cleaning and their farming and their irrigation. Building a shallow well that will, you know, dry up after 5 years is of no use to anyone. And I think, you know, that's the way in which we're behind. And I think, you know, in terms of answering your question of, you know, have I seen that level of corruption? I haven't seen that, but I've definitely seen the unwillingness to sort of change in the way in which we're working as a sector, because our Muslim audience or our supporters, the Muslim community, won't understand. Wait, why should I have to pay for this system? I don't understand. You know, I'd much rather pay for a well where I'll get the, you know, thawab for making, you know, quenching the thirst of 10 people. Do you know what I mean? Like for them, if I give £60 for a Ramadan food basket, for me that's tangible. I'm able to understand that instead of giving this person some tools to lift themselves out of poverty. You know, people want to see.
So we're behind in that aspect.
Yeah, you know, people want to see where their money is going tangibly, and they maybe don't have or I think it's the charity's sort of job to sort of explain, you know, that we need to have foresight. You know, if you give these people the tools now, in 5 years' time, they won't need our charity. There's no point just giving them a food basket. What you'll often find, even in the wider charity sector, is that, you know, they'll give food baskets, and often people just sell the food because there's more important things they need to buy. So I just think that, you know, we need to catch up, and the Muslim community as a whole needs to sort of catch up in that way.
Isn't that to a certain degree a level of corruption then?
I mean, I guess you could look at that way. Rather
than use the money, for example, to build a water system, that's sort of misuse of money when you're building maybe a well. I don't know.
I'm not saying a well is not helpful. It is helpful. It's just
sorry.
It's just not as helpful as it would be, you know, for building a water system. And this is the thing. If you don't have the right checks, and, you know, trust is great. It's an amazing thing, and we should trust people. But, you know, end to end, from the person that's donating £10 here to the very end, where that £10, the equivalent of that £10 gets to that, I don't know, Iraqi child or whatever it is. There are so many people in the interim, and you might not be able to trust anyone. Or even if it's not about trust, there might be some kind of miscommunication. And if you don't have all the checks and balances in place from A to Z, then something might go wrong. That what is it, £1 million you said that went missing, or however much it is, that I'm sure it wasn't I'm sure it was intentional. But the fact is that the checks and balances weren't in place for that to be prevented. And I think it's because we do treat our charities like a family, or because we have too much goodwill sometimes, that, you know, those checks and balances aren't in place where they need to be.
There was a joke that was going around a few years ago. They said the Prime Minister in Iraq, as he was out, he saw someone begging and then he stopped and he asked him, what's wrong? Why are you begging? He said, I don't have any money. So he said, you know what? Take his name, we're going to send him some money. So he went back to his office and he got $1 million or whatever, 1 million Iraqi dinars or whatever, and he gave it to one of the ministers and said, pass it on to this beggar. The minister gave it to one of the advisors gave it to, I don't know, someone else, and then it was just passed on. By the time they reached the beggar that was begging, they said the delivery man, the messenger came to him and said, the Prime Minister sends his salam and says he'll remember you in his du'as.
There you go.
So by the time it reached him, everyone took out their cut. Is there such, I'm only asking this because you mentioned that if someone donates £10, by the time it gets to the Iraqi orphan, is there such corruption where there's...
There's two things here. Obviously, like the intermediary sort of levels, you need to pay the driver, you need to pay administration costs, you need to pay for electricity, you need to pay for fuel. Those are not things I would call corruption. Those are running costs, or those are administration costs. Does corruption happen? Of course it happens. It happens everywhere, whether it's Muslim or non-Muslim. And by the way, I guess I should disclaim and say that the Muslim charity sector is doing a fantastic job. I feel like, we as Muslims sometimes have a complex that we're not good enough or we're not doing as well. In some cases we're not, as I mentioned. In some cases we really are. But given that we're in an environment where we're being scrutinized more than ever, because there is such Islamophobic rhetoric, in the world, we need to do better, is what I was trying to say. So yeah, there is corruption, but that corruption exists in non-Muslim charities too.
Is there a sense of nepotism within charities where this person's related to this person, so he gets the job. This person's related to that person, so he gets the job. He becomes the secretary. He becomes the treasurer. And it's not the right people in the right roles. I
mean, categorically, I can say to that. But I mean, I can't even deny that. No, there is. And again, because I said to you, we treat our charities like a family, and because literally we treat it like a charity.
Literally.
Yeah. Son, uncle, brother, cousin. But, because it might be difficult to attract the right talent, but do we even try?
Is that across the board?
I think so.
Within what we're talking here, Muslim charities?
Yeah, I think so.
So this is a sense of corruption then? Because not the right...
Putting words that you're going to get me into trouble.
No, I'm just trying to understand that, because, we really need the right people in the right positions.
Yeah, we do.
An alim, a scholar in religion, is good in fiqh, in his jurisprudence, and maybe theology. That's all he's going to be. But you can't give him, for example, a role in, if he hasn't studied, obviously, a role in finance or to be a treasurer when he hasn't really studied this field. There needs to be someone that has studied within economics or something within the finance sector who gets that role.
Why do we treat charities any different to businesses? If from my point of view, a charity should be treated with more weight than people's businesses, because people are giving you money.
It's amana.
It's amana, right? Then why are we treating it like a joke? If there is nepotism, if there is this corruption, if you are just giving a job to your brother who is not, nearly qualified and has no clue about accounting, you're going to be answerable for that if that money goes misused. I'm not saying it does. I'm just saying if it does. That definitely takes place.
I think that's the problem that Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam faced the most when he became the political caliph, which was certain people thought they were going to get government roles because they're related to Imam Ali alayhi salam, or because they were close to the Prophet. Because of that nearness they had to the Prophet, they thought when Imam Ali alayhi salam became the caliph, that's why a lot of people say, was Imam Ali really a good politician if within 4 years and 9 months there was 3 civil wars, whereas in previous governments there wasn't any. So there's a problem here within Imam Ali. That's not the case. The problem was that Imam Ali alayhi salam was just and fair.
This is it.
And people didn't like that. They didn't like his justice. He was just with his own brother. He was just with his own cousins who thought they could get a government role just because they're related to him.
I think this is it, isn't it? I think justice is sometimes a very bitter pill for people to swallow, and that's why there's that line in the Quran that says, you know, you believe, stand firmly for justice, even if it be against yourself or your kin or your kith. And this is the thing, often to actually be able to be really just, you have to give bitter truths that people are not happy with, whether that's your friend or your family. And that's really a lesson to take, I think.
Definitely. I don't want to get into too much trouble.
Might be too late for that.
Let's move to the work that you do in the UK. Believe it or not, you also do charity work in the UK, mashallah, which I mentioned also with regards to Grenfell and also gender justice. Grenfell, we all know about, heard about in the news. What do you do with regards to that before we move to the gender justice?
So I was there the morning of the fire in June, was it 2017?
Yeah, Ramadan, 3 years ago, Shahr Ramadan, subhanallah.
Very, very hot day. I think Maghrib was like 10 o'clock. Got there the morning of the fire. It was complete chaos. You know, I was working at Muslim Aid at that point, and you know, working on international disasters, you expect to see sort of that level of chaos in countries which don't have the right level of infrastructure or government or whatever else you might want to call it. But to see that on our own doorstep here in the UK was just something that none of us were expecting. There was just no coordination. There was, you know, no one knew what was going on. I remember speaking to this one man, and this is another story of resilience I wanted to share with you. I was speaking to this one man whose family lived on the 23rd floor of the tower. And, you know, he had his head in his hand when I approached him, and I said to him, "Brother, are you okay?" And he goes, "Yeah, I can't find my brother and his family. I don't know where they are. They live on the 23rd floor with me." So I was like, okay. And I said, "Okay, first of all, let me get you a glass of water." And he goes, no, I'm fasting. I said, "I think on this occasion it might be okay." You could tell that he had smoke on him, or like black sort of ash on his face. I mean, I hope it wasn't, you know, haram or not okay for me to say, but I offered him water. I said, "I think on this occasion it's okay for you to maybe take a sip of water. You know, you know, you've lost your family, you've been through massive trauma." And he would refuse to break his fast. He's like, no, I'm fasting. And can you just imagine, his home is on fire. You know, he lost his family, and he refuses to he's still got that faith and that resilience. Yeah. Anyway, so I spoke to him. I spoke to many people that were had escaped from the tower, and they had no idea what was going on. There was no sort of local authority that was able to help them and give them information. Anyway, so our organization had been helping with sort of giving them advice and support and sort of food, and making sure that there's halal food, because so many of them were Muslim, or the women needed, you know, faith-sensitive clothing because many of them were Muslim too. And being a Muslim community or Muslim-based organization was really helpful there. And following that incident, we produced a report called Mind the Gap, which basically spoke about how faith communities and local voluntary communities are able to fill the gap where local authority is not, because we have that knowledge of, you know, what's happening. You know, we have the faith sensitivities, the communities trust us. And then following that, there was like a national critical incident response unit that was set up, and then now there's a whole body that will look to help respond when there's national disasters around in the UK off the back of that. So that was a really successful campaign.
The gender problem seems to be one that's not just within the Muslim community, but within the wider society. And you do gender justice. You're part of this group. What is that about? And is that only within the Muslim community, or is that for the wider society as well?
So I think culturally, Islamic culture, if you want to call it, we've sort of lost what Islam or the Prophet came to us with. And the respect that the Prophet had for women and girls, and you know, the policies he kind of came with. And you know, you can see that in the way that he treated his daughter, or the policies he sort of implemented about how femicide, or girls that were being buried when they were born, how he abolished that kind of practice. And there's a movement that has been, I guess, started or led by a lady called Shaheen Ashraf in Islamic Relief, who had written the Gender Justice Declaration, where within our humanitarian work, we look to make sure that we're not leaving behind women. So, for example, the practice of FGM or the practice of early child marriage, we've sort of looked at that through Islamic lens of whether it's Shia or Sunni scholars, and seen that actually, I mean, this is a very controversial sort of theological discussion, but actually, is it okay to marry a 9-year-old girl off if she isn't ready, whether it's physically or emotionally, or you know? So, you know, all of this has been written in this declaration, and the way in which we respond in our humanitarian response is all included in that.
It's very important. Is this just for within the UK, or is this?
No, it's something that's being we're trying to sort of implement it globally, and we're trying to get more Muslim charities to sign on to this declaration. You know, one of the things, you know, as an example, in Somalia, FGM is a massive practice, and trying to sort of address communities and, you know, using Somali communities to sort of explain to Somali communities. So it's not like we're here coming from the West and telling you what to do. We're trying to change behaviors and attitudes, because the number of women and children that are affected as a result and die, or you know, because of all of these really inhumane practices sometimes, is really, really, really bad. You know, the complications at birth, you know, if a girl gets married at 9 and she gets pregnant, and you know, she might die in childbirth or have complications, and then the quality of life after that is really, really difficult. So just trying to like educate without sort of offending people about these different issues that are to do with women and girls.
I think, the gender justice issue is quite big, so I'm really glad that you guys are doing some work on that, and it's a topic that needs to be addressed. The conversations need to take place. There's a problem everywhere, whether it's within the Muslim communities or the wider society, with gender issues. Yeah,
I mean, one of the things we've done at the International Rescue Committee is during the pandemic we did a report where we interviewed women across 15 countries in Africa, and 73% of them, so almost 3/4 of them, said that they'd experienced violence or increased domestic violence over the course of the pandemic. And this is what I meant when I said that women, no matter what the disaster is, whether it's even just being stuck at home, you know, women are more affected than men.
Well, I'd like to thank you for your time today. There's so much more we could speak about, but inshallah for the future, we know you're going to relocate to Nairobi, so we wish you all the best. Why are you relocating, by the way?
So my portfolio is 23 countries in Africa and Yemen, so I feel like, you know, to be in the region and to work and live from there is better. It's better to sort of be in the context in which I'm working, so at least for a few years at the start, and we'll see where life takes me.
Thank you for your time. We wish you the best for the future. Inshallah, we pray that...
Before you end, just be like, if anyone does want to support your work, where can they find you?
Good point. Here at Progeny, we want to wish you the best. Inshallah, you mentioned something really beautiful and at the start, which was you're in the dua, the prayers of so many people, you and your family. So inshallah, that continues. You'll be in our du'as. Before we end, I'd like to ask if someone wants to get in touch with yourself with regarding to, I don't know, any aid they can support in, what they can do, how will they go about doing so?
I'm on Twitter, MADZ_Raza, RAZA. Send me a message on there. I'll give you my Instagram, or they can email me, or if you want to donate to the charity I work for, www.rescue.org.
Thank you very much. We'll add those details on the bottom, on the description of this video, inshallah. And we wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Assalamu alaikum.